Good morning. Good morning. Luke 8, go ahead and start opening up there while I unpack my papers. I've already been offered money to quit early. So if you see me with, no, it wasn't Adam. But if you see me at a barbecue joint with pizza and I'm paying cash, you just mind your own business. You just move on through like nothing happened. I don't have any jokes this morning. I thought I would try and pull a joke like Adam does, but I'm just not funny like he is. Adam knows. I can make Adam laugh. And that's not that hard because he just laughs at everything I say, but it's harder for everybody else to really hear it. I sometimes make Hannah laugh, but most of my jokes with Hannah are dumb, and she doesn't really appreciate them. She laughs because she married me, and that's about the extent of what we got here. I don't know if I can get this to work, and it might be dead, but we'll go anyway. So no jokes this morning. I hope you guys are awake. It's the Good Time Change Sunday, right? So this is the one where we went back, so hopefully you guys didn't do what I normally do. Because normally on this time change, I stay up an hour later because like 9 o'clock is really 8 o'clock, so I could just stay up an extra hour and get that sleep and then never ends up working out that way, and then I wake up tired. But still, for those of us with kids, Time Change Sunday is rough. The first one, the kids are always waking up late. This one, my kids are rolling out of bed at 5 a.m., and it's rough. So hopefully you guys are doing good. It's one of those weeks, time change, Halloween for those of us who celebrate, or as I was telling Tiffany Marshall this morning, it starts my Christmas decorating time. So if you come to my house, the tops are kind of lit up. I got a reindeer up front. I've probably spent way more money than I probably should on things that'll only be up for 40 to 60 days, or if I'm lazy, through Valentine's Day. But I would like to say that Halloween kind of kicks off Christmas decoration time, so Lake and I wasn't offended by the tree out there at all. So, in fact, I was hoping that more would be up when I showed up, but they weren't. So, Luke chapter 8, we're gonna look at the story here of Jairus and his daughter, and really there are two stories packed in, but I would like to argue and maybe hopefully convince you this morning that there's really one story. And Jairus is somebody, there are just people in the Bible when we say names and we think about where it kind of starts to trigger something in our mind. And Jairus should be one of those. Jairus, of course, is the man whose daughter's about to die. Jesus comes, and not to, spoiler alert, Jesus brings her back from the dead. And during this whole time, a woman with an issue of blood comes to Jesus and is healed. But I don't think the thing that we really start to think about when we think about Jairus is anything from the Old Testament, specifically from the book of Judges. But I think what the Gospels are doing, specifically Mark and Luke, is they're trying to make us as Bible readers, people who are interacting with God's word, call back to the Old Testament. And something Matt said a couple weeks ago, and something he's really caused me to think about was, I think every time Jesus opens his mouth, he's referring to something back in the Old Testament. And I think there are way more than we really realize times in the story and life of Jesus, and even in the writings of Paul, that they're looking back and saying, you don't understand. This has always been how it's always been, right? It's not just a split down the middle. There's an old and a new. This is the story of God. And it's, to borrow what the Bible Project says, it's a unified story that leads us to Jesus. And so what we have is, I think, Mark and Luke are specifically pointing us back to the book of Judges, and I won't make us read it for sake of time, but let me retell you the story. In Judges 11, we're introduced to a man by the name of Jephthah. Jephthah, again, is maybe one of those names that kind of causes us to begin to think, causes us to begin to remember the story, but Jephthah is a tragic story. See, Jephthah was born out of wedlock. The Bible tells us that his mom wasn't exactly the kind of woman that you marry, and so what happens is Jephthah is born to this family, and he lives in his town of Gilead, and the rest of the family essentially reject him because of his father's mistake. And so Jephthah goes out and he lives in the woods, and he goes out and kind of turns into like this rebel-rousing warrior guy there in the region of Gilead, in the woods of Tob, it's called there in the book of Judges. And what happens? Well, Jephthah's family there in Gilead, they need somebody. They need someone who's big, who's bad, and who's better than big and bad Jephthah, who was rejected and goes out and lives in the woods, right? And so they go to him and say, hey, we need you. They don't go to Jephthah and say, hey, we need you because you're technically our half-brother. Hey, we love you. We're going to bring you back into the fold. They show up, to Jephthah because they need something from him, right? And we all have those kind of people in our life, right? The kind of people when you get a call from, it's like, hey, how's everything been? And then 5 minutes later, they're asking for you. Melanie's is vigorously shaking her head. We definitely have those people in our lives. And for Jephthah, that was Jephthah's own family. And Jephthah lives in this region of Gilead, surrounded by people who don't love him on one side, and on the other side are the Ammonites. And his family goes to war, and Israel goes to war with the Ammonites, and God raises up Jephthah, and he goes and he helps his family deliver the people of Israel from these people, the Ammonites. But during this tale of who Jephthah is, Jephthah makes one big mistake. Jephthah, the Bible tells us, has the Spirit of God come upon him. And then what he does is he makes this vow. And he says, God, if you give me this battle, I'll sacrifice whatever or whoever comes out of my house. And the Bible tells us that he walks up to his door, he wins the battle, and his daughter is what comes out of the house and greets him. Now, I would argue, and it's maybe not a hill I'll stand on, but I'd argue that Jephthah knew that someone was going to come out of his house. I think Jephthah probably wasn't 100% correct on how he should worship Yahweh and what he should do. And he thought maybe like the Ammonites, who he lives right next door to, who do human sacrifices to worship their God, I think he kind of figured, like, I'm going to sacrifice someone. He just really didn't count on it being his only daughter. And the story of Jephthah just kind of ends. His daughter goes out for 2 months and lives in the woods and mourns the fact that she'll never be able to marry and never be able to have kids. And then the verse kind of tells us that Jephthah did what his vows said he was going to do. And there's some arguments on whether or not he committed her to the temple or he did something else, but I'd wager that he killed her. Jephthah does this thing when his daughter comes out of the house. He says these words, "What have you done to me? Why did you come out of the house? You have brought me low. I opened my mouth and there's nothing else that I can do." And then the story just kind of ends. And that's hard. That's hard. I was talking to Jeff Lux a couple of weeks ago about this. Some stories in the Old Testament are just hard. They're hard for us as fathers to read, you know, like, and Jeff and I were talking about the story of Abraham and Isaac and how difficult it is to read stories like this. And the story of Jephthah is no different. It's hard. It's hard to read about a man who lives in the region of Gilead, who's rejected and is brought back in, but not brought back in because of love, brought back in because he's needed. He really struggles, I think, with rejection. And so when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, he needs something else. He needs another reason, another thing to talk about to God. So he offers someone as a sacrifice, not realizing it's going to be his daughter, and then begins to blame his daughter for his own vow, and then goes, I can't do anything to stop this. And then the story just ends. You see, but that's not where the story ends. Because I think the Gospels are trying to tell us that Jesus is here, and he has a way to fix this. If we look in Luke chapter 8, the beginning of the story before we meet Jairus, Jesus heals the demoniac of Gadara, right? And those are big words. It's a demon-possessed man who lives in a region called Gadara or the Gergesenes, right? And really, I think it's just translations between different, Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew and where it's all at. The way that best to explain it is Jesus goes to the same region Jephthah's from. Jesus walks up to the same region Jephthah's from, and the first thing he's greeted by is a man who struggles with demons. A man who's so full of demons that he calls himself Legion, and Jesus casts him out into the pigs. And I think what Jesus is doing is he's setting the scene. He's like, you see, 1,500 years ago, a man worshiped my God and my Father in the wrong way. Maybe he was influenced by other demons, by other spirits. Either way, I'm here to conquer that. And he casts out the demon. And then he gets in a boat, and he journeys, and the next man he meets is a man by the name of Jairus. And what's interesting about Jairus is named after a judge. And if you had to guess, that judge is Jair. And Jair was the judge right before Jephthah. And so you start putting these pieces together, you start realizing that, yes, in the book of Judges, Jephthah's story ends very oddly until Jesus comes to town. So let's begin to read. Verse 40, Luke 8, let's start right in here. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue, and falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house. For he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying, and Jesus went, and the people pressed around him. So Jairus is a leader of the synagogue, probably a wealthy man, probably a man who has a lot of money. He's not like a rabbi. He's not a spiritual pastor type guy. Instead, what they would have is similar to like this building would be a synagogue. And they would have a wealthy man who would kind of control and take care of things. And he was able to use his money. And this man knows that Jesus is coming. And what does he do? He goes to Jesus and he implores him. Mark says that he falls at his feet and begs. It's just, Jairus is laying it all on the line. His daughter's 12 years old. She's about to die. My guess is he's done everything he can that money and status and power would allow him to do to save his daughter. And he has one last chance. Rabbi Jesus has shown up. And he goes, the synagogue that I'm about doesn't agree with this. If I had to guess, Jairus is laying it all on the line. Because by bowing at Jesus' feet and asking for a miracle, he's probably not going to be able to go back to his job on Monday morning. Probably a lot of Jews aren't going to want to do business with him there in his little town. Why? Because you're following the guy who calls himself the Messiah. But for Jairus, he's at this point. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Jesus is here, and I need a miracle, right? I think some of us can identify with that. I think a lot of us can identify with that. Those of us who have kids, I remember it was a few years ago, Trevor had gotten croup, right? And for parents, croup is like that word that we really don't know what it is. We know the sound that happens with the cough with croup. And I remember Trevor was kind of like this barky cough. And I did something I swore I would never do as a parent. I pulled Trevor's like bassinet into my room, which I'm very much against as a parent, only because I value my sleeping time. And like that gave me like an extra 5 minutes to kind of like roll over and wake up Hannah. That way she could go when the kids were sick. But she's finding this out for the first time. Sorry. No, I'm messing. No, so I bring Trevor into the room, and I remember we're getting ready for bed, and Trevor had this croupy cough, and I remember we looked down in his bassinet. It was like a portable crib, and he wasn't breathing. And I remember the look on his face as he's laying there trying to breathe. And I remember picking him up and cradling his head, and as I picked him up vertically, he would breathe, and as I put him down, he would stop breathing. It was just the croup had, just kind of just however it was. And I remember Hannah sat I believe in the back or even the front seat. She held him as we drove to the hospital. I just remember as a father, I would do anything in that moment. I would do anything in that moment to make sure my child lived. And for a lot of us, it has to do with our kids. For some of us, life has just kicked us to the point where I would do anything to fix this. I would do anything. And this is where Jairus is at. Let's keep reading. Verse 43. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. 12, same amount of time that Jairus' daughter, how old she is, and I wager that she's been sick. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him, Jesus, and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. So right in the middle of this whole thing, Jairus is walking Jesus back to his house. I want you to imagine for a moment how Jairus feels, the hope, right? The hope that he feels like he can maybe see his house in the distance. Jesus is walking. The crowd is walking. He knows he has him. He has the guy. This is the guy. He's going to heal my daughter. And unknown to Jairus, there's this woman pressing through the crowd. She's unclean. Not unclean because she's bad in any way, but because the law says that she is sick. So she's not supposed to be around people. She's not supposed to be able to attend the synagogue that Jairus is in charge of. Society has told her, not only are you a woman, which in Bible times isn't exactly the best role to have, but now you are sick and unclean, and this woman is risking it all. She's pushing through the crowd. She is touching people. She is doing the exact thing that the entire world of her day has told her you are not allowed to do. And she reaches out, and the Bible tells us she touches the fringe of Jesus' garment. That fringe is probably a tassel that's at the bottom of his robes. In Hebrew, it's called the zitziot. It's a little tassel. You'll still see them. Jews still wear them on prayer shawls. They'll have zitziots, or they'll sometimes have them on undershirts, and that's how they'll wear them. It's commanded that Jews have these on their garments. And she reaches out, and she just grasps this tassel that Jesus has, and immediately she's healed. Immediately she's healed. She's laid it all on the line. If she's caught, she's killed. If she's caught, maybe she's not killed. Maybe she's ostracized permanently for the rest of her life. She cannot find a husband. She can no longer have kids. She's done. If she's caught, she is done. And she reaches out and she's healed. Let's keep reading. And in her worst nightmare, verse 45, Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and are pressing around you." But Jesus said, someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me. I want to pause there. Imagine you're Jairus. Hope is there, right? You see your house. It's on the horizon. There's a crowd all around you, pushing you and Jesus forward to your house. Maybe the people know that your daughter's been sick, and so they're helping lead Jesus. Maybe there's a parade because they're so excited. They know Jairus, the wealthy synagogue leader, his daughter will finally be healed. And Jesus stops to ask, who in the world touched him? What? Like, you want to know what, Jesus? Like, you're not asking, like, who hit me? Or you're not asking, like, who didn't, take a bath this week because you smell weird. Instead, the question is, who touched you, Jesus? And Jesus doesn't stop. It's not like, who touched me? And they go, there's a lot of people just like, oh, okay. He pushes the question. And here Jairus is waiting for Jesus, wondering, is my daughter going to even make it? And here Jesus is wondering who touched him. And now imagine you're this woman. You're this woman who's like, I'd imagine you've taken every precaution you can to keep yourself quiet. You've hidden, you've done everything you can, and you touched Jesus, you've been healed, and you thought you could sneak away. And Jesus calls you right out. He calls you right out. And what does the woman do? Verse 47. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and she fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. This might be my favorite verse of the story. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. See, when I was originally reading through this, and when I had originally heard a person talk about the connection here, I thought, it's Jairus and his daughter is a comparison to Jephthah and his daughter. And I don't think that's the case. I think Jairus and Jephthah are two fathers, and they're being compared and contrasted in the story. And I think this woman here is the daughter of Jephthah, is being compared in that way. And this is why I think that. The story of Jephthah has a cycle. Jephthah is rejected by his family, and somebody comes back and brings him into the fold. He rejects his daughter, and she goes out into the woods, but no one comes to get her. And I think Jesus shows up, and he goes, daughter, welcome back. Welcome back. This is where you belong. And I think for so long, we have struggled as Christians not only to feel welcome, but then also to make others feel welcome. And here Jesus shows up on the scene, and he calls her daughter. And if I'm correct, I think it's the only time, if not one of the only times, Jesus refers to someone as daughter. And he looks at her and he goes, daughter. And it's like Jesus knows. And I wonder if in Jesus' mind, he's picturing Jephthah. I wonder if he's picturing the daughter. I wonder if he's picturing exactly what happened. And he realizes that Jesus is here. Jesus is here. I can fix this. I can fix this. Let's keep reading. And while Jesus was still speaking, someone from the ruler or Jairus' house came and said, your daughter is dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. But Jesus, on hearing this, answered, do not fear, only believe, and your daughter will be well. And when Jesus came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James, and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her. But Jesus said, do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called and said, child, arise. Her spirit returned, and she got up at once, and he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them not to tell anybody what happened. One other thing I wanted to point out in the comparison between Jephthah and Jairus is the words Jesus used there for child arise. I believe Mark records it as he specifically almost changes languages. I think he uses Aramaic, and he says the words Talitha cum. Talitha is how Luke chooses to translate as child, but that word could also be used as little lamb. And I wonder if Jesus used that word specifically because he knows that Jephthah offered his daughter as a sacrifice, a way a lamb should have been used. And he goes, I'm here. You see, this story, I think, points us to three things I think that Jesus does specifically in this story. I think Jesus reverses the cycle of sin in our life. I think Jesus takes the cycles that have been done to us, and he doesn't just make them better, he reverses them, right? And it's like this idea of life has been so tainted by the consequences of sin. And we're like, if it could just be okay again. And Jesus is like, it doesn't have to be okay again. I'm here to reverse it. right? Jephthah didn't get his daughter back. That's a consequence. But Jairus got to see his daughter healed, and we get to read this story and understand that our God is powerful enough to reverse anything. Not only can Jesus reverse sin, I think he redeems people. I think he redeems the woman in looking at her and calling her a daughter. And he tells her that your faith had made you clean. And as I read so many people as they talk about this story, it's so interesting to me. By touching Jesus, this woman made Jesus unclean. But by touching Jesus, Jesus made her clean. Right? There's this idea that we have struggled for so long that I want to stay out of the muck of the world. I want to stay out of the drama of the world. But Peter calls us priests. And the very thing priests are supposed to do is they are supposed to get down into the muck and the blood and the gore of the world. And we are supposed to go out into the world and say, listen, I am here. And Jesus does exactly that for this woman. He does it for the Father. He takes this gift the Father has. He looks at Jairus, and I wonder if Jairus knows the story of Jephthah. I wonder if he understands that Jephthah pushed everything onto his daughter. He took the cycle of sin that had been done to him, the rejection that had been done to him, and he pushes it onto them, right? And for us as fathers, for us as mothers, for us as parents, and just people in general, humans, we take the filth of life that has been pushed onto us and we just push it onto somebody else. We act out in anger, we act out in wrath, we act out in malice. We do so many things wrong and we just act out. And Jesus shows up and goes, I can fix that. I can fix that. And he redeems us. And he looks at a woman and calls her daughter. And he looks at a father and says, I can fix this. And the last thing Jesus does is he restores. And this has been big for me lately. I love the idea of Jesus and restoration. I love the idea that Jesus can take relationships and mend them and make them whole. I'll give you an example. Last year, my father passed. And if you've known me for, I'm 32 now. So for the last 27 years of my life, you cannot sit in a room with me and a dad joke not come off my lips, right? And those that went to school with me just laugh because they just know. It's oftentimes people will make a joke, hey, my dad just called me to tell me Merry Christmas. Be like, oh, it must be nice to have a dad who calls you and tells you Merry Christmas, right? It's just something I've always done. It's a coping mechanism. And my father passed last year. He went missing for a few weeks and he had a heart attack, and it was a long struggle that I had with my father, who he was as a person. And I remember it was almost a year ago recently. I took his ashes. We split his ashes into 3 ways between the 3 children, my brother and my sister and I. And we each did our own thing with them. And I took my father to Lake Tahoe. And for me, Lake Tahoe holds a lot of significance. My mom has taken me to Lake Tahoe. Near Lake Tahoe is, for those who either grew up Baptist or are old, one of the two, sorry, for you kids that didn't grow up the way we did, there was a show called Bonanza, right? Yeah, see, okay, certain people recognize it. In Bonanza, it was a single father and 3 sons. They were cowboys, and they lived on the Ponderosa Ranch. And they filmed that half a mile away from Lake Tahoe there, into the woods there. My mom took us there when we were in junior high or grade school. And so for me, that's a spot that held. I watched the Cartwright family and wanted a dad like that. And so I took my father's ashes there, and I played the song from Mercy Me that's kind of been my anthem about my dad, and it's called Finally Home. And the song starts, I'm going to wrap my arms around my daddy's neck and tell him that I missed him. Tell him all about the man I could have been and hope that I pleased him. And I used to listen to that song, and I used to struggle. Let me tell you this. I placed his ashes there next to the lake, and I played that song. And I told someone this a few weeks ago. For the first time in my life, I felt love for my father, a man who had nothing good to give me. And I can be honest about that. A man who didn't care for me, a man who struggled mightily with mental disease and mental health and pushed the things of life back onto me. And the only way that I can say that is because of Jesus. It's because Jesus restores relationships. And that's exactly what Jesus does here. He takes a woman who's been pushed out of society by the law, who's been told you're not good enough, and he says, you're a daughter. Daughter, you belong to the family. He shows up to Jairus, and he goes, if you believe, she will be healed. And then raises her from the dead and goes, go and get something to eat. Go and get something to eat. There's nothing more normal than sharing a meal. And I'm here to restore families. That's what Jesus is here to do. And I encourage you this morning that he can do that for you too. He's done it for me. He's continuing to do it for me, and he can do it for you. But I think there are 2 things in this story that both of these characters did that I think really changed and really allowed that to happen. Number one, you got to show up. You got to show up. And this is hard. This is hard. As I was writing this out, I couldn't help but think just about the way I grew up. And I don't like to, especially in the last few years, I don't like to just bash the way I grew up. I am so thankful for where God put me. I met my wife there. I got married there. I met some of my best friends there. I got to teach Adam at school there. And that relationship for me and Adam has been fantastic. I've got to meet, I would say a vast majority of this room because of where I came from. God has used that for me, but from where I came from, I was forced for so long to do. I have to be something. I have to do something. And what happens is it forms into this idea of, oh, I'll show up and I'll do what I got to do, and then I'll go home and do my own thing, right? And there's this like legalism that almost works into there, and I don't like that word all the time. But in my own heart, that's what it started to creep in. I was who I was because of what I did, and what I did was good when I wanted it, and then the other 95% of the time, it's up to me, right? I can do what I need for God on Sunday, and then Monday through Saturday are mine. And that's what happens. We come from cycles of doing, and then we come out of it, and we're encouraged by the rest the gospel has. I don't have to work for my survival. God's done it all. But you got to show up. And you can't let the pendulum swing from I've worked so hard to now all I got to do is sit and rest. No, you got to find the middle ground. You got to show up. You got to show up. Jairus didn't just send his servant that worked for the centurion that didn't work for Jairus. The woman didn't just like send a letter to Jesus. She had to show up, and you got to bear it all. You cannot expect God to work in your life if you just sit down and don't do anything. You have to show up. You have to open your heart. You have to bear it out, and you have to say, God, I'm willing to give up everything for you. I'm willing to bet that Jairus lost it all, but he got his daughter. But in that moment, losing it all is really hard. Let me tell you. Second, your heart is laid bare and you're opened up and you say, God, I'm at my last rope. I will do anything I can. God goes, okay, I'm here. But you have to show up. You can't expect God to work if you're not willing to show up. Jairus showed up. The woman with the issue of blood showed up. Secondly, I'm going to borrow a phrase from this podcast I've been listening to that has really become a mantra of mine this year. You got to trust the story. And what do I mean by that? The Bible is the story, right? And the story is this. God created a world, and it was good. God is a loving God. God is love. God loves you. You are valued. He wants to partner with you. There is enough in this world for you. And if you don't trust the story, you can't do anything with it. And let me explain. And I love this specifically in the story with the woman of issue of blood, because Luke takes special account. Mark says that she touches the bottom of his garment, I think. And Luke says she specifically touches out and reaches out and grabs the fringe, which I said was the Hebrew word zitzio. In Malachi, chapter 4, there is a prophecy of the coming Messiah. And it uses a phrase. It says there will be healing on its wings. It's talking about the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness. And that the Messiah will bring healing on its wings. That word wings there in Hebrew is the same root as zitzio. And I think the woman with the issue of blood knew that somewhere in the Bible it says that near the wings there's healing. And if I can just touch God, if I can just touch the Messiah's tassel, anything, it'll give me healing. She knew her story and she trusted it. She trusted that we have enough. The Sermon on the Mount has a very weird like break in one of the verses. It's actually something I had thought about preaching before. It says, it's talking about where our money goes, and it's right before the verse where Jesus says, you can't serve God and mammon, right? Mammon, the word for money. And it says if your eye is essentially as the light of your body, if your eye is full of darkness, then how much more your body is full of darkness. And what Jesus is talking about there is there's something we still refer to it, like sometimes you'll hear it as giving somebody the evil eye, right? You've probably kind of heard that before. You give them someone the stink eye. It's kind of where it all comes from. And back in the day, you give someone the evil eye, you were looking at them and cursing them. But to have a good eye is how God looks at you. He looks at you with a generous eye, with blessings. And the Jews were encouraged to have a good eye on those around them, to be generous with what they had. And I think this woman, she realizes that having a good eye means what? I trust that there's enough. I trust that there's enough. I heard it put this way. Imagine you go to a dinner party, right? And at this dinner party, there's as much food as you could possibly want. The host there is a very generous and benevolent host. And he said, you will be able to eat until your heart is content. You will be able to drink until your heart is content. There will be presents. There will be anything. You will never have to want for anything else. Just come to my party. And you show up at the front door and you knock. And inside you hear war. And inside you hear fighting. And you hear grabbing. And you hear this and you hear that. And you walk in the front door. And you see people have now hoarded what they have. They have taken things off the table. And the host is just kind of standing in the middle of the house as these different factions have all broken off. And he's like, I don't understand. There's more than enough. And that's the world in a nutshell. God creates a world. It's a party. There's enough. We can have everything that we want to have. Yet what we do is we take and we hoard and we do this. And what does that do? That causes us not to trust the story. There's not enough healing for me. If I go and do this, then like you won't be able to get what you want. I won't be able to get what I want. And we fight. And the Bible says it leads to anxiety. And it leads to us judging others. That's where Jesus gets into take the beam out of your own eye before you go and to visit the speck in your brother's eye. And this woman shows up and she grabs the tassel and goes, I trust you, God. I trust that you have something for me. You have good for me. How does Jairus do that? And I would argue he would do it in the way that it's not even written in here. I think it's implied. He stands and waits while Jesus heals the woman. Now imagine, again, I remember when Hannah went into labor with, I think it was Trevor. It had to have been Trevor. And I remember we got in the car and it was late at night and we drove down, we lived in Maryville, so we drove down Taft, and then we cut across 30 and then we were going to St. Anthony, so I cut down Main Street right through Crown Point. And at one point, I must have hit over 100 miles an hour. And again, I was a young guy. I was like, I don't know, how old was I, Hannah, 22, 23? Somewhere around there when Trevor was born. So, there was a thought in the back of my mind, be like, how cool would it be if I got pulled over and be like, my wife's having a baby, let's go. Now, there was some of that, I'll admit. But also, there was also like the element of, I need to get there now. I need to get there now. Now, of course, in like normal birthing stories, it was like hours before Trevor even showed up. I mean, it was a while. But I needed to get there now. I remember a few years after that, I think it was a few years after that, my mom had her first heart attack. Remember vividly, for us sports fans, it was on the Sunday when the Seahawks threw the ball instead of running the ball. That's one of the things I remember. That actually happened while my mom was in the hospital. It was snowing, North Indiana. It was snowing. I don't think we even had Trevor yet. I remember I was at church. Hannah wasn't feeling well, so I left her at her parents' house, which was in Hammond, near First Baptist. And they tried calling me, and they kept calling me, and I kept like, you're calling me during church. Decline. You're calling me during church. Decline. My brother was calling me, and finally, they called a friend of ours who was at church. He came over, he goes, hey, you need to call your mom, or you need to call your wife. And I'm like, okay, so I call, and she goes, your mom's having a heart attack. I got in the car from Hammond, in the middle of a snowstorm that's like dumping inches an hour. I pick up Hannah from Hammond, and I made it to St. Anthony's like in under 30 minutes. I don't know how I did. I couldn't go fast enough. I imagine that's what Jairus was like. He was like me in the car, flying as fast as he could. I mean, it was some of my best driving that I had ever done, both times, both for the baby and while I was on my way to the hospital for my mom. And I imagine Jairus is like that. I wonder if his steps quickened a little bit as Jesus got closer to his house. Then Jesus stops. And Jairus sits back. And we never hear that Jairus goes, but if you heal her, what about my daughter? I think Jairus trusted. He can heal her. He can heal my daughter. Because the next statement is, your daughter's dead. Jesus looks him in the eye and goes, believe, all be well. And Jairus goes, okay. How do we know that? Because all was well. And for Jairus, it worked out. And so when we look at these stories, I hope we see a bit of ourselves in them. I hope it resonates with us. I hope we look at the Jephthahs and we go, yeah, I've had a bit of that in my life. Yeah, I've been pushed away, and I've pushed that out on somebody else a lot of times. And then I hope we look at Jairus and go, but it's not too late for me to show up to the master's feet and put it all on the line and say, I need you. Maybe we look at Jephthah's daughter and we're like, I've had a lot of that in my life too. I've been told I'm not good enough, I don't deserve it, messed up, I'm unclean. and show up at the master's feet and say, I know you have healing for me somewhere. I know it. You said it in your book. You said it in your word. You have healing for me. I know you do. I'm trusting what you have for me. He can restore, he can redeem, and he can reverse everything that we thought was all messed up. And I love that about Jesus. But we got to show up. We can't just expect to just sit there and be a bystander. We got to show up and we got to be a part of it. We have to open our hearts. We have to bear it all. We have to put it all on the line. It's him or nothing. That's why he says you can't serve God and money. We have to serve God. Got to pull it all on the line. You can't have a mixed heart. Double-minded man is unsteady in all of his ways, right? We cannot be double-minded. We have to serve him. And along with that, we have to trust the story. What's the story? There's enough. There's enough for you. And what does that mean? That means that challenges us to go find the women with the issue of blood in society, to go find those people who have been told they're not good enough, to go out and find those people who have told you are unclean and say, daughter, son, I got someone for you. We need to be like Jairus and show up at the feet of Jesus and say, I got someone at home who needs you. That's our job. We have to come, we have to trust the story, and lastly, we got to go do it for somebody else. No one went after Jephthah's daughter. And I wonder if, as a father, the idea is Jephthah could get out of the vow. How? You just do it to yourself and your daughter can live. But for Jephthah, he felt like there was no way out. No one went after his daughter. No one went after them and said, hey, listen, this is not how you worship Yahweh. Yahweh isn't about that. You're listening to something else, whether it's another spirit, whether it's your own soul, whether it's the cycle of sin that's in your own life. You're listening to something else. So I encourage you this morning, show up, trust the story, and then be like Jairus. Be like the woman with the issue of blood. Go after somebody else. Let's pray. Lord, I see so much of myself in this story. As a father, I struggle so hard sometimes, God, just to be the one you want me to be. I look at Trevor and I look at Brooklyn, and I'm so thankful for what you've done for me as a father and given me the opportunity to be one. And God, I see myself in Jephthah, opening my mouth when I shouldn't be. God, I see myself in Jairus, who's just at his wit's end. Lord, I've been there, like the one with the issue of blood. I struggle. I struggle, God. Maybe you're sitting out there and you feel the same way. Maybe you feel like the cycle of sin that has been done to you, you're just perpetrating it and pushing it on to someone else. Maybe the sins of the father are now visiting the sins of the son. Maybe the society has told you you have to be this, and so now you've done it. Let me tell you something. Someone's coming to town. He can fix it. Maybe you've hurt somebody. Maybe your sin has led to the spiritual death of somebody. Maybe it's hurt somebody to near death. Well, let me tell you something. Someone's coming to town. He can fix it. Maybe you're Jairus. Maybe you're a father who's kind of scared to give up everything, but you know what? Jesus is coming. And you're at your wit's end, and your rope is right there. It's twisting, it's shredding, it's about to snap, it's about to break. The only thing you can do is show up. It's good enough. Maybe the one with the issue of blood. Maybe you've been told for too long that you're not good enough, you're unclean. Maybe you are unclean. Either way, someone's coming to town. We need to show up. We need to open our hearts. We need to bear it all. We need to trust the story. There's enough. There's a God who loves you, and he wants to partner with you. He doesn't want you to do this whole life thing alone. He has a kingdom, and the kingdom is way more powerful than any of those gods of the Ammonites. He can conquer them. He did conquer them. He cast them out. Remember the story before? He can do the same for us. We just got to show up. We got to trust the story. Maybe you're already there. Maybe you trust the story. Plenty of other people out there who need us, who need him, who need the master to come to town for them. Would you take a minute? Maybe you need to come up and pray. Maybe you need to just pray at your seat. Maybe there's somebody on your heart who you need to go pray with or pray about. Would you take a few minutes and would you open your heart to what God has to say?